I'm Michael Holly, and I'm director of the Research and Academic Program at the Clark, and very happy to see you tonight, and thank you for braving this nasty weather. Rick Beinecke said to me as he came in, this is weather only fit for explorers, so now you've been anointed. Let me just tell you very briefly before introducing tonight's speakers why we're doing this. The Clark's begun this phase of its campus expansion program, which includes the Tadao Ando Visitor Exhibition and Conference Center. And we are, during this period of construction, the Clark has launched a new initiative called Clark Now. And all of the brochures are downstairs, one floor on the registration table. Clark Now is a series of exhibitions, installations, conferences, and programs that the Clark will present over the next 2.5 years to engage with audiences in new ways on and off the Williamstown campus. And we're very happy to be initiating this series of programs at the Explorers Club. Because with Clark Now, the Clark is increasing its presence in New York through the new outpost here. This was the former home of Robert Sterling Clark's brother, Stephen. And through a series of exhibitions and installations in New York, we're making it our home. The one thing that we're excited about is the first Clark Now exhibition in New York is going to be here in this club by Mark Dion, who has been commissioned to create an installation titled Phantoms of the Clark Expedition that will be presented this coming April. Here, the installation, which is investigating Sterling Clark's activities as an explorer before he became an avid art connoisseur, will consist of a series of dioramas and sculptures related to his China expedition, and the Dion work will be installed throughout the exhibition. But that's not what we're doing here tonight. Tonight we are very ready to listen to our two presenters there, and I'm sure you're eager to hear them. Hal Foster, who won the most coveted Clark Prize 2 years ago for art writing, is the Townsend Martin Class of 1917 professor of art and archaeology at Princeton, where he went for the first time in 1997. He teaches lecture and seminar courses, as I'm sure you know, in modernist and contemporary art and theory. He also directs the graduate pro seminar in methodology. In addition, he's a faculty member of the School of Architecture and the Department of German. He also works with programs of media and modernity and European cultural studies. Recent books, of which we certainly have a sampling right out there on the table, include Art Since 1900, a co-authored textbook on 20th century art, Prosthetic Gods, 2004, concerning the relation between modernism and psychoanalysis, and Design and Crime of 2002 on problems in contemporary art, architecture, and design. In fall 2011, 2 new volumes were published, The Art Architecture Complex by Verso, and the first Pop Age, which I guess is coming out next week, Painting and Subjectivity in the Art of Hamilton, Lichtenstein, Warhol, Richter, and Rouchet, published by Princeton. He is presently at work on a theory of modernism as a way, in the words of Walter Benjamin, to outlive culture if need be. Hal's also a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he continues to write for October, which he co-edits, Art Forum, and the London Review of Books. You'll also be able to talk to him afterwards when we have a reception right across the hall. But as his interlocutor this evening, we have Robert Slifkin, who was recently appointed Assistant Professor of Fine Arts at NYU's Institute of Fine Arts. He received his PhD from Yale a couple of years ago, but what we're most proud of, he received his master's from Williams College in 2002. The Williams College graduate program in the history of art is also housed at the Clark. Rob's research interests include contemporary art, 19th and 20th century art and culture, as well as the history of photography and critical theory. He is published on Donald Judd, Philip Guston, and James Whistler for the Oxford Art Journal, October, Art Bulletin, and American Art, and has recently completed his first book entitled Out of Time, Philip Guston's Return to Figuration and the Crisis in the Humanities. He's now at work at another book project focused on the renewal of monumentality in contemporary art. And in addition to teaching, he is currently a fellow at the Henry Moore Foundation. So you not true? Okay, forget that. Don't believe everything you read, no. But we're ready to hear what you two want to talk about criticism now and then. Thanks for coming, all of you.
Yeah, why don't you?
Welcome to my club. Glad you're all here. I feel I should have an ascot on. We should have single malt and cigars or whatever. I'm not sure what we'll talk about is really right for this setting, but we did want to hit on questions of method then and now. I'm the then, Rob's the now. Talk a little bit about this question of the contemporary and what it might mean for the discipline of art history. And then I thought I would end with a diatribe that I've written for the occasion, which I think will be highly inappropriate in this setting, about the post-critical. And so I think we'll maybe go out with a bang. And that'll be just 10 or 12 minutes of just straight on me. But for the first part, this is where the art historian always defaults to the slides. Can I have the first slide or two? This should be reminded what he wants to say, or what she wants to say. That's probably not it.
No. Sorry. There we go.
That's all right. Okay, just topic one. Obviously, method is a huge topic. I just wanted to give you one example, as precise as I could make it, of a strategy, if not a method, that was very important to my milieu. I'm 56, Rob is 38. Sorry, I had to tell him. So I was formed intellectually in the 1970s. And critical theory was the avant-garde. It was hugely important. And a crucial aspect of critical theory, and by critical theory in the 1970s, I mean for the most part, new French philosophy. A crucial aspect was the idea of a critical return, a critical rereading of foundational figures. So can I have the next slide, Aruna? This will be scary. This is my Explorers Club right here. So French theorists like Althusser and Lacan and Foucault and Deleuze were concerned to reread these figures, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche, against the interpretations that had built up over the decades. So Althusser, for example, wanted to cut across the young Marx, the one that was still humanist, still concerned with the human condition, to the not so old but older Marx, who was really concerned with a scientific account of class struggle. And he wanted to reclaim this Marx. Lacan did a slightly different thing. He went back to read Freud in his own intellectual moment, but in a way that Freud couldn't quite comprehend. In other words, he wanted to reread Freud through the linguist Fernando Saussure, and to rethink psychoanalysis through a contemporary of Freud that Freud could not know. So that enabled him to rethink the unconscious famously as structured as a language, to rethink how we are, in a way, spoken by our unconscious the way we were spoken by the language that we enter. And then lastly, Foucault and Deleuze and others returned to Nietzsche to develop an idea really of critical genealogies, how to do history, if you like, against the official narratives. I mean, to trace the effects of power on the stories that we tell about our pasts. So, some of you in this room remember this moment. This was extremely dynamic, this idea of a critical return, a critical rereading. And directly, indirectly, I think it was taken up by some of us in art, in modern art and contemporary art. Give the next slide. And one example now from 2 decades ago is the way in which Rosalind Krauss and Yves Lambois reread Picasso, also through Saussure. Again, contemporary, like Freud, of Saussure, that he could not have known. But rather than, say, read this papier-collé and the collages of circa 1912 in the usual way as a formal experiment with the flatness of the picture, or even in terms of social history, to register the pressures of mass culture like the newspaper on forms of high art. They wanted to rethink Picasso through Saussure, which is to say to see if there was not a semiotic moment in Cubism, to understand this Cubism, this aspect of Cubism, as an exploration of how things come to signify. So they would read this papier-collé really almost as an array of different science systems, kind of a demonstration, even though, again, Picasso knew nothing of linguistics and semiotics was not invented. An analysis of just how things come to mean. We could go into it, but he plays on 3 or 4 different kinds of science systems here as he evokes the still life of a violin. Not directly, but semi-directly, I was influenced by this example. Can I have the next slide, Runa? So in my first book on surrealism, I too wanted to go back to the surrealists and read them in a different way, read them in terms of their own epistemological space, or what they might have known, could have known if they knew what we know about that moment now. So this is actually, I should just tell you right away, this is a double exposure of the artist Hans Bellmer with his first poupée, his first doll. So and here I was influenced by Krauss, when I hit surrealism, the account of surrealism was still very much driven by André Breton, that surrealism was a celebration of erotic love. And I wanted to see, or I thought I saw, a very different dynamic in surrealism. The problem for my return is that the surrealists did know Freud, but they knew only the early Freud of the interpretation of dreams, the one that was actually concerned with desire. And I was interested to see if there was not the Freud of the drives, in fact the death drive above all, at work in surrealism. So my critical return to surrealism was to reread the surrealists into relation to another Freud that opened up a space, an epistemological space that I thought might be, if not more accurate, at least more intense about the surrealist project. So All these are examples of a kind of methodological strategy that in one way or another we picked up from these French theorists. And also want to say, maybe the next slide, Aruna. This will enrage Michael. That and I could give you other examples of this strategy of a critical rereading. We were all driven by contemporary commitments. For example, I would not have come to my psychoanalytical reading of surrealism without the example of the feminist critique of psychoanalysis. And I could give you other instances of contemporary commitments that led to historical projects. And this was really important, and this really gets us back to the reading of Nietzsche at this time, because he was the one who stressed this idea of critical genealogies. You know, write a history of the present is how Foucault interpreted Nietzsche, which is not to say, you know, you put the past in the service of the present, but you use what compels you about the present to open up a historical project and to think differently about the connections of past and present. And here is where the Germans came into play, and Walter Benjamin above all, because in his last great essay before his suicide and flight from the Nazis, his theses on the philosophy of history, he argued for this kind of history, as he put it, history read against the grain. And that idea of a critical genealogy, Nietzsche called it an effective history, was really important to me. Let me just remind you what Benjamin had to say, because I want to counterpose it to Panofsky, who I admire too, but not in this moment. So this is Benjamin famously in 1940. Again, he's in desperate straits. He writes, "The true picture of the past flits by. The past can be seized only as an image which flashed up at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again." So we were really taken by this idea of history, that in emergency, if you like. And it seemed more real, more effective, more critical than the other model of history that was given to us in our art historical studies, which was history really as redemption. So this is Panofsky, safe in exile, actually, in Princeton in the same year, 1940. This is what he has to say about the humanities. He says, almost the inverse. He says, "The humanities are not faced by the task of arresting what otherwise would slip away, but of enlivening what otherwise would remain dead." So we were interested in an approach to the past that used the present to cut through, you know, interpretations that seemed dead, but didn't want to enliven the past, but wanted to seize it and to render it dynamic in relation to the present. And let me just say a few more things before I ask Rob to respond. This had very important effects, it seems to me, because it offered a new way to, or new ways to connect the past to the present. But paradoxically, it also insisted on breaks, on historical ruptures. Coupure épistémologique was the term from Althusser. And that too was very much the rhetoric of our theory, again, mostly inherited from the French. And that led us to, for 20th century studies, models of a modernism that would be displaced utterly by a postmodernism, or a historical avant-garde that had to be recovered by a neo-avant-garde after the war. So I think this very insistence, even though we wanted to think genealogically, this very insistence on ruptures, on the end of this, that, and the other thing, led us into a condition which I think opened up this Pandora's box of the contemporary as a category that seems to float free from the past. And maybe I can have the next slide. And this is where I will fall silent for a bit. Next one, too. A couple years ago, the editors at October, as to say, me, sent out this questionnaire to a range of critics and curators and historians. And it was really to pose this question of, what are we to do with the contemporary now that it's become such an important field? Is it a field that seems to be disconnected from other fields in the discipline? But I've gone on long enough. Do you want to hear?
Okay.
I think this is the only one that works.
Let's see. I was formed in the 1970s as well, in a more literal sense. Yes, in an embryonic way. And I say that.
You read Theory in the Womb.
Yeah, that's right. My
That's
parents were
awesome.
listening to Mozart. But I say that because I feel that in some ways my generation, I'm very wary of speaking on behalf of my generation.
Go for it.
Yeah. That my generation, I feel in many ways, has internalized many of the insights that Hal's generation so sophisticatedly described. That is to say, that the critique of representation, that the critical return to Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud produced, and in particular, I'd say the critique of totalizing history, that I think Freud and Marx representing these teleological models of historical causation and consciousness that a Nietzschean return in many ways critiqued. We grew up in a world where we were drinking the water, so to speak, of postmodernism. And
You mean the Kool-Aid?
the Kool-Aid, yeah. Well, no, that would be in the 60s. No, we were drinking the Capri Sun of postmodernism, I think.
Logan did.
Yeah. And I say all this because this might already be kind of prefiguring the last subject that we'd like to talk about, which is this kind of post-critical crisis. But I think it also speaks to the issue of the contemporary, in the sense that, as it's been at least described by many art historians and critics, it's a crisis. It's a critical issue of how does one talk about contemporary art. I say this in terms of the kind of critique that was marshaled by this earlier generation, in the sense that it's based on a kind of problem of periodization. How do we know our period style? What does it mean to be a 21st century person? It seems, when we look back at the past, that when we talk about the 50s, we think about abstract expressionism, and we think about men wearing Brooks Brothers suits and hats, and there was a certain kind of hegemonic culture that, of course, we can imagine places of resistance to, but it's easy to periodize. And then, of course, the 60s has its own cultural imagination. And it seems that the question is the contemporary a problem just in a basic kind of almost existential problem that one can never know one's own time because it's a problem of distance, that one doesn't have the critical distance to know it? Or is it more of an epistemological problem? Is it, in fact, that somehow we have become so deeply well-schooled in critiques of historical, the fact that notions of historical totalization are often, as Nietzsche would teach us, marshaled in the name of power, or that to say this is true or this represents something is typically marshaled in the name of the will to power. That we've become so well-schooled in this that in some ways we're wary to periodize. We're wary to say that this is what it means to be alive in the 21st century. This has much to do with globalization and pluralism, that we've become, again, if Jacques Derrida in the 60s began formulating notions of difference, and we've become nothing but incredible practitioners of celebrating difference. And often, again, this is the liberatory, progressive genealogy of the 60s in many ways. But to think dialectically, that the darker side is that our celebration of difference has in some ways made it very difficult for us to think in terms of totality, to think collectively. Is one way to think about this. It's hard for us to even imagine how one period style could represent a moment. And so I say all this just to kind of suggest that this is a crisis, I think, not only for earlier generations, but for my own generation, which has been charged with the responsibility of historicizing the contemporary. And the question is this a charge that is just institutionally provoked because there's more money in contemporary art? I think that's the way certain people are seeing this, that the rise of contemporary art as an art historical discipline is just a response to market forces. But I think another way to think through this is that our interest in the contemporary is a symptom. It's a symptom to a certain anxiety that we have about our inability to think historically, right? That our concern with the contemporary as a period style, so to speak, speaks to the condition, the post-historical condition, that I might argue in certain regards is the result of precisely the kind of critiques that the critical return that Hal described produced. That's to say that, and again, just to suggest that it's neither good nor bad. This is just a situation we're in. And it seems the challenge for both art historians and artists, at least as I see it, is one of, I don't even know if I'm comfortable saying, thinking about a new kind of form of collectivism or totality, or at least a way to think historically, which I would argue entails a certain degree of totalization and collectivity, just in the sense that history, like any form of fiction, is a provisional totality. To say, I woke up this morning and I came to the Explorers Club, you're already in the realm not only of history, of fantasy, yes, absolutely, yes, that's right. And this might, I'll just kind of maybe just end my own brief monologue and hope that we can have a discussion about this, where I see, I think, some space of critical practice and at least artistic potential in this, because I know we're moving into the realm of the post-critical, which is maybe it's just worth saying that it's precisely, or I believe it's precisely, this crisis of historical imagination, the crisis of being able to imagine oneself as a historical actor, as someone within a certain kind of temporal matrix, that might be responsible for a crisis of criticality, a crisis of criteria. How do we judge? I mean, maybe this speaks to your critical genealogy, that through these connections between avant-garde and neo-avant-garde practice, for instance, you were able to discern a means to judge what is good art or what is critical art. Would you buy that?
Yeah.
Right. There were certain, just as the previous generation before you could speak in terms of classic modernist tenets of self-reflexivity and medium specificity as a way to discern, or autonomy, to discern what was the most significant or even the best art, that it seems that we have a certain crisis of criteria. How do we know what even is good art if we don't know, if we can't think about it historically, if we don't have a goal, if we don't know what the good would be? It becomes very difficult to speak about quality in art. And again, I think this relates to questions of pluralism. We've become very adept at celebrating difference, so that questions of quality become very dangerous or difficult in that sense as well. But I'll just end on a high note or a happy note, in the sense that I do see in the last 10 years, I think, many artists engaging with questions of fiction and parafiction, artists who are making, or moving more and more into the realm of cinema often, and engaging in practices where the realm of the imagination is entering into, is interacting with the realm of the real world. And one way to think about this is that I think modern art, modernist art, that is to say post-war art, and even the art of the 70s, when of the moment of your critical formation, can be understood as nonfiction, that the highest ideal of art, of abstract expressionism, in terms of at least the Greenbergian, the flatness of the picture plane articulated the truthfulness that paint is just dripped paint, and that it wasn't trying to be an illusion. There was no depth, or the minimalist object that had a kind of phenomenological presence, or the conceptual work of art that almost looked like a document, an office document. That all of these iterations of artistic practice espoused a model of nonfiction. And again, I'm interested in various works of art recently. The one that comes to my mind most readily is Christian Marclay's The Clock, which I'm most interested in, as some of you might know, is this 24-hour film made up entirely of film clips of people looking at watches and of clocks ringing. So it's functional. It's actually a kind of, it is an avant-garde dream of a functional object that actually works in life in some ways. But it's made up entirely of fictional films. There's no documentary films in that. And it creates this idea that there's this world of Hollywood that more or less functions without us, that kind of exists, that doesn't need us. And again, I feel like that is the world of my generation, although I can't help but feel like Roger Daltrey when I say that, you know. That for us, the idea of representation as reality or as a cohesive world is the ground upon which we act in some ways. And again, that's just to suggest that perhaps that might produce a different set of criteria that might not be entirely based on criticality, because criticality is predicated on a criticism of, or in a kind of Schmittian sense, having an enemy in some ways. And it's much more difficult, I think, for my generation, the generation of Foucault and Apple instead of Coca-Cola and Marx, you know, to kind of see mass culture or to see commodity culture entirely as an enemy. It's not, we don't, certain people of my generation, I don't believe have as much of an agonistic relationship. And I think it creates this crisis of criticality. And just again, the point I wanted to make about fiction was that fiction does entail a degree of historical imagination to create these fictions, like The Clock, which really is about waiting, right? The film is constantly about people about to do something. I think thematize, at least in a certain regard, a struggle among younger artists and younger art historians to think historically. We might not have arrived there yet, but I think fiction, in the world of fiction, one might say, presents a new model of historical thinking.
Can I just ask you a question or two and then proceed with my diatribe
Yes.
and open it up to you all? How do you differentiate between the good fictive and the bad fictive?
Right.
I mean, just if it is a criterion, it should be a principle of judgment. I mean, I think, you know, one thing that is implicit in this genealogy of criteria, I mean, even before me, people talked about quality. This was a Greenbergian term of judgment that had to do with this question: can this contemporary work stand up to the masterpieces of the past? So it was a criterion vis-a-vis the tradition, vis-a-vis the canon. And this was displaced in the 1960s, kind of neo-avant-gardist moment, by the criterion of interest. I mean, famously, Donald Judd said, "A work of art needs only to be interesting." So there, it was open. The artwork was open to all kinds of connections that were maybe more synchronic than diachronic, or social too than historical, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And then in my generation, the generation of some of us here, criticality almost became a criterion of its own, and in that very ality became reified as such, perhaps. And I think there are contenders, but of other criteria. I mean, one can have one, too many flowers of criteria. But I think temperamentally, intellectually, I remain a little bit suspicious of the register of the fictive and the affective, as you will see when I get to my
Yes.
attack.
I am too, because well versed in my critical theory, I know that the fictive becomes the mythic, right? That's the danger of the fictive, is that it naturalizes what is in fact cultural in many ways, or the fictive that does not acknowledge its fictiveness. I always think of what Roland Barthes says in Mythologies, which is, I approach pointing to my mask, right? That is his model of the fictive, the good fictive, in a sense, the fictive that allegorizes its fictiveness. And so maybe that
Demaskifies,
yes,
demystifies.
yeah. And again, I would say the bad fictive in our current moment is the example that I know you mentioned, perhaps in a footnote in your post-critical essay, about the famous incident that was published in the New York Times Sunday magazine 10 years ago now, where Karl Rove said, to the journalist, "You report reality, we make reality," which in some ways does seem like this kind of bad dream of postmodernism, right? The very kind of tenets that we kind of claimed to be radical gestures that reality was in fact constructed have now been marshaled by perhaps hegemonic forces in some ways. So I say all this I'm not entirely convinced myself, because I know the dangers. And yet, one way to think about good fiction, or at least in terms of criteria, maybe that's the better way to answer it, because I think that good fiction is the fiction that points to its mask. And in that sense, good fiction is art, because art is a genre that is not life, right? Art is always, we walk into a gallery, and it's always fiction. I remember asking my students recently, what would it mean to imagine certain kind of relational practices or social activist practices that are very prevalent in the art world right now, something like Rio Tirvanit's work, and imagining it as fiction. Just you go in, and it's not about getting a meal, it's about having a performance in some ways. And so, I mean, again, just to suggest that the genre of art is good fiction, because in its very autonomy, it makes it good fiction. But in terms of criteria, I would maybe argue for a word that I'm not entirely comfortable with either, which is agency. And I'm thinking about Alfred Gell's book, Art and Agency, that was published a few years ago. And also someone like David Joslet, who has begun formulating notions of art, not in terms of dualisms of cooptation and criticality or complicity and radicality, but rather in terms of ratio, and how a work of art can enter. It is precisely, again, being a fiction in the world of fiction, which I would say is the kind of condition of art in the 21st century, that it can enter into these systems of fiction, whether it's mass culture or going viral might be the most obvious example, where the effective work of art is actually the work of art that somehow engages within current systems in some ways. So it's precisely the way that it kind of sacrifices its autonomy that we can judge its quality. But I'm not entirely convinced of that myself.
Maybe just let me ask you one more question, and then, or should I just jump into it?
Well, we want to be able to
Right.
ask
Well, I can skip the post-critical bit.
No, I think everybody waits for
I mean, okay, then I'll just ask it as a rhetorical question. We can pick it up later. I wonder why this would be a moment when historical imagination is so difficult. I mean, we've lived under capitalism for centuries now. I mean, this was a topos in discussions about postmodernism, presentism, and amnesia. Why now? Why wouldn't it be possible to have a project, driven by the present that would connect, importantly, to a past in a way that would redound again on the present? I mean, I can come up with many examples, from not in my generation, too. I mean, why wouldn't that be possible in the present?
Should we return to that? I mean, in some way, the short answer, in some ways, the short answer, I think, is that that it is the bad dream of postmodernism. Just to say it in a short answer, that it's precisely that, and here I'm saying my generation again, that we have trouble with conviction. It's what all you old people say about us. That
You fall quiet, young man.
But I say that it has a kind of epistemological foundation, that we, again, have grown up in a world that has trained us to respect pluralism, to recognize that, in fact, there is no universal truth, and that, in fact, even something as close to our hearts, our feelings, are probably the result of representation, right? We go to movies and people say, oh, you felt that way.
You didn't get that from me.
No.
Okay. Can I have the next slide?
I didn't get that from you, no.
Okay, this will take about 10 minutes, and it's written for this evening to be clear, but it's not completely airy. I mean, so I hope you listen attentively. Or just tune out, your choice. And this really is about where I think we are, or where I am, vis-a-vis critique right now. So critical theory took a serious beating during the culture wars of the 1980s and 1990s, and the 2000s were only worse. Under Bush, the demand for affirmation was all but total, and today there is little space for critique, even in the universities and the museums. Bullied by conservative commentators, most academics no longer stress the importance of critical thinking for an engaged citizenry. And dependent on corporate sponsors, most curators no longer promote the critical debate once deemed essential to the public reception of advanced art. Indeed, the sheer out-of-dateness of criticism in an art world that couldn't care less seems evident enough. Yet what are the options on offer? Celebrating beauty, affirming affect, hoping for a redistribution of the sensible, trusting in the general intellect. The post-critical condition is supposed to release us from our straitjackets, historical, theoretical, and political. Yet for the most part, it has abetted a relativism that has little to do with vibrant political pluralism. So how did we arrive at this point where critique is so broadly dismissed? Over the years, most of the charges have concerned the positioning of the critic. First, there was a rejection of judgment, of the moral right presumed in critical evaluation. Then there was a refusal of authority, of the political privilege that allows the critic to speak abstractly on behalf of others. Finally, there was skepticism about distance, about the cultural separation from the very conditions that the critic purports to examine. Criticism is a matter of correct distancing, Benjamin wrote over 80 years ago. It was at home in a world where perspectives and prospects counted, and where it was still possible to adopt a standpoint. Now things press too urgently on human society. How much more urgently do they press on all of us? Yet not all critique depends on correct distancing. Estrangement a la Brecht is not correct in this sense. And there are interventionist models in art from Dada to the present in which critique is produced imminently through techniques of mimetic exacerbation, I think pop is an example, and symbolic détournement. It's situationism to many examples in the present. As for the other old charges, which come mostly from the left, they boil down to two in the end. Critique is driven by a will to power, and it is not reflexive about its own claims to truth. Often enough, these two fears drive these two accusations. On the one hand, a concern about the critic as ideological patron who displaces the very group or class that he or she represents. This is the famous caution given by Benjamin and the author as producer of 1934. And on the other hand, a concern about the scientific truth ascribed to critical theory in opposition to spontaneous ideology. That's the dubious position assumed by Althusser in his rereading of Marx. Such fears are not mistaken, but are they reason enough to throw the baby out with the bathwater? More recent attacks, especially on the critique of representation and the critique of the subject, have operated through guilt by association. Rather than too confident of its truth, the critique of representation was said to sap truth value as such, and so to promote moral indifference and political nihilism. The critique of the subject was also charged with unintended consequences, as its demonstration of the constructed nature of identity was said to abet a consumerism of subject positions, as in multiculturalism repackaged as the united colors of Benetton. For many, these two outcomes count as postmodernism tout court, which is to be condemned outright as a result. Yet this is a caricature that reduces postmodernism to the rote expression of neoliberal capitalism. That is, as neoliberalism deregulated the economy, so postmodernism derealized the culture. More pointed critiques, can I have the next slide? More pointed questions about critique have come from Bruno Latour on the left there, who focuses on his field of science studies, and Jacques Rancière, who focuses on his hobby horse of contemporary art. For Latour, the critic pretends to an enlightened knowledge that allows him to demystify the fetishistic belief of naive others, to demonstrate how this belief is a projection of their wishes onto a material entity that does nothing at all by itself. Here, the fatal mistake of the critic, according to Latour, is not to turn this anti-fetishistic gaze on his own belief, that is, his own fetish of demystification, a mistake that renders the critic the most naive one of all. Latour concludes, this is why you can be at once, and without even sensing any contradiction, one, an anti-fetishist for everything you don't believe in, for the most part, religion, popular culture, art, politics, and so on. Two, an unrepentant positivist for all the sciences you do believe in, sociology, economics, conspiracy theory, genetics, whatever. And three, a perfectly healthy, sturdy realist for what you really cherish. And of course, it might be criticism itself, but also painting, birdwatching, Shakespeare, baboons, proteins, and so on. He's very clever. For Rancière, too, the man on the right, critique is compromised by its dependence on demystification. In its most general expression, he writes, critical art is a type of art that sets out to build awareness of the mechanisms of domination to turn the spectator into a conscious agent of world transformation. Yet not only is awareness not transformative per se, Rancière continues, but the exploited rarely require an explanation of the laws of exploitation. Moreover, critical art asks viewers to discover the science of capital behind everyday objects and behaviors, but in so doing only confirms the transformation of things into signs that capital performs. Like the critic for Latour, the critical artist for Rancière is trapped in a vicious circle. I'm almost done. Yet much the same can be said of these two metacritics. Latour replays the critical move of Marx and Freud, who argued as follows, you moderns think you are enlightened, but you are in fact as fetishistic as any primitives, fetishists not only of the commodity, but of any object you desire inappropriately. To this reversal, Latour now adds his own. You anti-fetishistic critics are also fetishists of your own cherished method of critique. To this extent, then, he remains within the rhetorical coils of the very critique he wants to cut. Rancière joins in this challenge to the hermeneutics of suspicion, this kind of critical demystification that counts as critique, a la the Frankfurt School and many other schools. Yet not only is this challenge a familiar one within critical theory, it was also fundamental to its own shift from a search for hidden meanings to a consideration of the conditions of possibility of discourse, as in Foucault, of the significance of textual surface, as in Barthes, and so on. Moreover, Rancière condemns critique for its projection of a passive spectator or reader in need of activation. This is his version of the naive believer in need of demystification. Yet he too assumes this passivity when he calls for activation beyond mere awareness. Finally, his redistribution of the sensible, this is a mantra, is a panacea. And when pitted against the capitalist transformation of things into signs, it is little more than wishful thinking, the new opiate of the art world left. All this said, one understands the fatigue that many feel with critique today, especially when taken as an automatic value. It hardens into a self-regarding posture. Certainly its moral righteousness can be oppressive and its iconoclastic negativity destructive. Against this image of the critic, Latour offers his own. The critic is not one who debunks, but the one who assembles. The critic is not one who lifts the rugs from under the feet of the naive believers, but the one who offers the participants arenas in which to gather. The critic is not the one who alternates haphazardly between anti-fetishism and positivism, like the drunk iconoclast drawn by Goya, but the one for whom, if something is constructed, then it means it is fragile and thus in need of great care and caution. Now, who could not warm to this figure of the empathetic critic? Yet such an ethics of generosity introduces a problem of its own, which is in fact the old problem of fetishism, for here again the object is treated as a quasi-subject. Recent art history shows a marked tendency to do much the same thing. Images are said to have power or agency, pictures to have wants or desires, and so on. This corresponds to a similar tendency in recent art and architecture to present work in terms of subjecthood. Go to the next slide. Although many practitioners in both fields, art and architecture today, aim in good minimalist fashion to promote phenomenological experience, often what they offer is the near reverse. Experience returned as atmosphere or affect, in spaces that confuse the actual with the virtual, or with sensations that are produced as effects, yet seem intimate, indeed internal, nonetheless. Examples range from James Turrell to Oliver Eliasson, kind of the next slide, in art, and from Herzog and de Meuron to Philippe Raum in architecture. In this way, the phenomenological reflexivity of seeing oneself see approaches its opposite, an installation or a building that seems to do the perceiving for us. This too is a version of fetishization, for it takes thoughts and feelings, processes them as images and effects, and delivers them back to us for our appreciative amazement. As such, it calls precisely, I think, for anti-fetishistic critique. The same is true more generally of cynical reason, the dismissive knowingness that drains so much energy from our cultural lives and our political lives alike. The problem is not that truths are always hidden, Latour and Rancière are right there, but that many are all too apparent, yet with a transparency that somehow blocks response. I know the mantra of no taxes is a boon to the rich and a bus for me, but nevertheless. Or, I know the big museums have more to do with finance capital than with public culture, but nevertheless. As a fetishistic operation of recognition and disavowal, precisely I know, but nevertheless, cynical reason is also subject to anti-fetishistic critique. Of course, such critique is never enough. One must intervene in what is given, somehow turn it, and take it elsewhere. Yet that turning begins with critique. And actually, I will spare you the last bit, but I will send it to you if you want, because I see some of the people groaning, so I'll desist. All right, that's 2 more pages. I'm very sensitive too. There she goes. That's my avant-gardist moment. Scandal at the Explorers Club. Maybe I am dead wrong. What about the blossoming of critical art today? The rub here lies in how these two words do or do not come together. It is common to speak today of social practice art. Can I have the next slide? But this rubric underscores how removed art is from everyday life, even as it attempts to close that divide. It is with a similar magic that Rancière declares the political and the aesthetic always already bound up with one another. In fact, rather than hold the two terms together, such rubrics, social practice art, tend to release a given practice from the criteria of either social effectivity or artistic invention. the one tends to become the alibi for the other, with any pressure from the one side dismissed as sociological, and any pressure from the other as aestheticist. And so the announced resolution breaks down again. Let me end with an opposition that, though schematic, seems pertinent to this predicament. On the one side, there is a quasi-Gramscian position of activist art that, with aesthetic autonomy dispatched by an unholy alliance of critique and capital, sees a field wide open for social practice as art, or art as social practice. On the other side, there is the quasi-Adornian position that still insists on the category of art, but with the forlorn sense that its minimal autonomy now holds minimal negativity, and with little left to do but to go through the formalist motions. Have the next slide. In a way, this complementarity recalls that of Dada and Surrealism as seen by Guy Debord, who in his version of dialectics as mutually assured destruction once wrote, Dadaism sought to abolish art without realizing it, and Surrealism sought to realize art without abolishing it. However, our situation today might evoke the 1920s in more alarming ways still. Economically, as an age of boom and bust, politically, as a period in which a state of emergency becomes more normal than exceptional, sort of a state outside the law, and artistically, as a time when, as some practitioners act out economic crisis and political emergency, as Dada did, or build from this chaos, as constructivism did, others flee it in a return to order. I think there the parallel to the return to degraded versions of the neoclassical tradition in the 1920s might be the return to old idioms of modernist painting and art and sculpture now. If there's anything to this echo of the 1920s, then surely it is a bad time right now to go post-critical. So that's where I am.
I think Hal and Rob would entertain maybe a few questions. So,
We're happy with denunciations too.
Can you hear me? I'm not sure. Are you familiar with the Bravo TV show, The Next Great, or it's called Work of Art?
Yeah.
I was. I've been dying to get your thoughts on that. I'd love to hear any thoughts.
Actually, I'm not so familiar. Sandy, my wife and I tune in whenever we hear that a friend of ours might be on. That's about as close a reader of that text. How about you?
I don't have anything. I mean, I've seen it once or twice.
What do you want?
Yeah,
what do you want out of it? You tell us.
I don't
what you see in it.
think it's wonderful or anything. I mean,
No, I don't either. I fear sometimes its role that it might be playing right now.
Well, I think one way to think about it, it's symptomatic, right, of a certain configuration of the art world right now, which is highly monitorized, and I mean that to me that would be its significance. It's an ugly symptom of the way that many people see the art world, including people inside the art world to a certain degree. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I would just add that even though it seems total right now, this world of the market and the media as complete determinants of contemporary art, and the need to create a persona even before you have work to launch a career. I mean, that's what that show is really about. And it is about, reality TV as fictive. I mean, this is where I want to push back a little bit on the fictive. But that condition's not new. I mean, what I really discourage among my students, who are now much younger than I am, I mean, they tend to go, first day is their expressions. They think art is about their feelings. And then they learn about the market and the media, and then they become cynics. The condition of the commodity, capitalism, that's with us for a long, long time. The question is what you do with that condition. I'm most interested in artists that don't attempt to flee it to an imaginary elsewhere, but work with it to see what they can do with whatever limited agency they might have to go somewhere else. So I can imagine a person would come on that show and just detour it, just take it somewhere else entirely. That would be cool.
Yeah, just going, building off that question of what you do with it. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what I take as you feel that Rancière is sort of toothless in this formulation, the distribution of the sensible, and I completely understand that. But I'm wondering why it can't be in operation dialectically in relation to capitalism's transformation of signs, the way in an earlier model, just, for example, Benjamin Buchloh talking about the aesthetics of administration, and somebody like Hans Hacke creating a kind of mimicry of certain capitalist formulations. So I'm just sort of wondering why we couldn't read Rancière more dialectically in relation to the kind of current state of capitalism.
Well, I think that that would be for you to do. I mean, I don't think it's really a dialectical concept. Look, this is a polemic. I appreciate many aspects of Rancière, but I don't appreciate the way it's taken up as, I agree with Rob that we need a historical imagination that involves the utopian imagination, but it's taken up almost in the guise of wish fulfillment on the part of artists. It allows them to misrecognize the transformation of things and designs into capital. Too much, my position. So,
well, I think the power of Rancière's thought is less. I think when he talks about art, he's actually deeply conservative in many ways. But I think when he talks about culture and when I think of the distribution of the sensible, I think about it in terms of more mass cultural forms of communication, and something that I think the distribution of the sensible is a way of making things that were previously invisible, whether literally or figuratively, or inarticulable, visible and articulable. So that the aesthetic for Rancière is about really pushing boundaries. And
that's what critique is.
Well,
that's just another definition of what we've always had, which which is my position.
Yes.
Yes, but why? I don't think we need the wishful dimension that I sense in his read.
No,
as it's read by students.
Oh, sorry. No.
That was a sign of like.
I agree. I'm off-put by the wishful aspect as well, but I just find it, in some ways, an actual description of a dynamic that actually occurs when one can think of the example of, in the 70s and 80s, the increasing presence of non-white males on television that actually made certain populations more visible and articulable than they were before, and that had real effects. So, again, I think Rancière, when he thinks about the aesthetic, is not thinking entirely about art all the time. He's thinking about the aesthetic in a much more diffused way. And that's when I think he's most useful.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps we'll have time for one more question. Is that right?
Are there drinks involved?
I'm curious about this idea of criteria as related to sort of proliferation of different canons that we see based on, these ideas we've internalized. And I'm wondering whether criteria can also proliferate in various genres as related to the authority conferred by the art market, and whether that's not a solution but a viable way to think about it. And one of the things I'm speaking about in particular is sort of, differing modernisms and maybe Brazilian art, which is modern Brazilian art, which has been developing as a field and now is having the show at the Gagosian in Paris, and this idea of sort of its own linear development just within that genre.
Just that I mean, talking to other people who practice contemporary art or who have thought about it, that is something people say, that, you know, just as in some ways when we talk about the art of the 15th century or 17th century, we talk about the art that was patronized, right? That is what's significant in some ways. And of course, its greatness just happens to be congruent with the fact that it was part of the established order. And so why shouldn't we be studying these things? I don't know if I'm speaking to what you're speaking to. The idea that what we should be doing, and this maybe speaks to the post-critical aspect, right? That as art historians, our job is not to, in some ways, make evaluative judgments, but rather just talk about what is historically significant, right? Just because this work is being presented at major institutions, it must in some ways speak to certain aspects of our culture, and thus it's our job as intellectuals to analyze it. You know, we don't need to celebrate it, we don't need to denigrate it, but we need to talk about what it means. I mean,
Yeah, this is where I differ, I think, because I still want to hold on to the historical and the critical as bound up with each other, and not pretend that I can be objective as a historian and committed as a critic. I mean, I know that's not exactly what you meant, but what concerns me, I mean, again, I'm all for 1, 2 flowers of criteria. I think they all should bloom. And I don't see, I mean that sincerely, because I think you're right, that in art history now, in a global context, we are alert to the ways in which different traditions have different criteria. But the extraordinary thing about Kant, I mean, about Enlightenment aesthetics, is there was this proposal. This is not about history, it's really about aesthetics. There was this proposal that we all, as humans, had this capacity called sensus communis, that there was this common sense that we had, that if I thought that this was beautiful, I mean, his example was, this is beautiful, but our example would be, this is art. That if I make that claim, I would want that claim to have universal validity. And I would want you also to believe in it. Now, obviously, this has come under massive critique, but I think that's a kind of a utopian idea. It can be a totalitarian idea, as many utopias can become. But that's a utopian idea, that there is a capacity that we have. And what we don't do anymore, I mean, we might have with Duchamp, we might have even with Andre, fought over that declaration, this is art. Now even the most sophisticated people do not. Or maybe because they're sophisticated, they do not. They say, I like this, I like that. So for Kant, that would be a fall from matters of aesthetic judgment to questions of agreeability and disagreeability. And the human, even though I'm, for the most part, anti-humanist, the human would be lost in that condition. I think that is, in a way, our condition now. We're all too ready to let everyone else go the way they want to go and say, oh, you're into that? That's cool, I don't know much about it, maybe I like it, maybe I don't. That's not good enough.
Well, maybe it's the historical moment to see what a post-Clark conversation is like by joining us all for a reception across the hallway. And thank you.